When I was in 6th grade, my biggest dream was to become a published author. 11-year-old me thought it would be the coolest thing ever to have a paperback book with my name on it. Even cooler than that was the thought of me hanging around in a bookstore as hundreds of fans lined up for me to sign their copies. I didn't even have a signature back then. Once the school year finished, most of my classmates were off on a plane trip to another country, or biking with their friends, or playing video games. But I was determined to finish writing a manuscript for a novel idea I had. The novel was to be called Forgotten, and it followed the journey of an 11-year-old boy named Jack Witter who barely survives a plane crash and finds himself stranded in the Amazon rainforest. If this plot sounds familiar, it's because I mostly copied it from Gary Paulson's famous novel Hatchet. I was eager to write a book, but I certainly wasn't creative with ideas. Every morning in the summer, I'd sit down at my desk and force myself to write at least 5 pages. I thought if I can write 5 pages per day, and I want a 200-page novel, then I could be done in 40 days. 40 days to write an entire book. When I thought of it that way, it seemed easy. Of course, as all writers know, writing 1 page a day, let alone 5, can be an enormous challenge. And I ended up calling quits on that book after chapter 5. But I was still determined to write a book. So I picked myself back up and began writing a new story called Until We Die. The plot went something like this. 16-year-old Ethan Parker wakes up to find his house invaded by zombies and seeks refuge in a local precinct, where he teams up with a girl named Jennifer and her wise grandfather, Mr. Taylor, to survive as long as they can. This book I partially based off of a trilogy I'd read by Eric Walters called The Rule of 3. Again, not particularly creative on my part. Like my previous attempt at writing a novel, I never ended up completing this one, quitting 96 pages in. With another failed attempt and school starting up, I pushed my dream of writing a book to the back burner. But the next summer, after grade 7, I was convinced again I had it in me to write a novel. This time, I called it Frostbite, and it featured a group of high school students who fly on a trip to Anchorage, Alaska, but end up in a plane crash, left to survive in the winter wilderness. Yes, 2 of the 3 novels I ever came up with involved plane crashes. This time around, I was much more regimented in my writing schedule, with my mom preparing Earl Grey tea in the morning for an early writing session, visiting the library in the afternoon for a change of scenery, and coming home in the evening to write some more. In addition to writing the novel, I had a cinematic trailer plan and a few book cover designs laid out. After spending half the summer on the manuscript and writing 131 pages, I grew bored of it and moved on. Now, another year passes, and it's the summer after grade 8. I had just graduated middle school and felt ready to take on the world. With no ideas of what to write about, I simply chose to write about writing. After a week of day in, day out work, I finished the manuscript. After 5 months of pitching agents and publishers, I got a publishing contract. And after 10 months of working with editors and designers, I got my book published. It was one of the happiest moments of my life. Looking back though, I really shouldn't have done what I did. I spent a good chunk of my childhood forcing myself to type words on a computer while other kids played outside. But what surprises me most about those years of my life is how I managed to never give up. Even though I bounced from one story idea to the next, I never lost sight of my overarching vision to write a book. Maybe novel A sucked, but that didn't mean I'd abandon my dream of becoming an author. I'd just move on to novel B. And if novel B sucked, I'd move on to novel C. And maybe by the time I got to novel N, I'd have a book worth publishing. However, if you came up to me today and said, "Peter, I want you to write a book over the summer," I'd be pretty uncomfortable about my prospects. Why? Because today I'm less optimistic than my middle school self, and that's a problem. You see, when I was a kid dreaming about publishing a book, I never paid much attention to the obstacles I would encounter later, from the hair-pulling monotony of pitching different publishers to the snail-like speed of the publishing industry. Many people don't know this, but it can take years for a book to go into print from the date you sign the publishing contract. Back then, the only thoughts I had were, writing a book would be awesome, and I need to put in the effort to do it. I never thought, what if I don't get a publishing deal? What if my book sucks? What if I don't get reviews? What if my marketing efforts fail? Why would anyone agree to publish a kid who hasn't even entered high school yet? These are perfectly reasonable questions. And yet, if I'd asked myself them at the very start and parsed through them question by question, there's no way I would have ended up publishing a book. I would have felt crushed by the seemingly impossible odds and given up far too soon. If I had taken the so-called realistic advice of my friends and family and said, you know what, becoming an author at my age is ridiculous, why am I even trying? Then I most certainly would not have become an author. It was only by taking the seemingly unrealistic approach, what many would consider the optimistic approach, that I was able to succeed. And that got me thinking, if being optimistic resulted in a better future than being realistic, is it really so optimistic after all? As I thought more about it, I came to the conclusion that often what we deem to be optimistic is in fact quite realistic. And often what we deem to be realistic is in fact quite pessimistic. I learned that optimism isn't always naive, or childish, or impractical. Rather, it can be reasonable and deliberate. It is something that should be practiced intentionally, not because it makes us feel good or because other people are doing it, but because we recognize that being optimistic is the intelligent thing to do. Now, I'd like to focus on that last part, the intelligent thing to do. While I claim being optimistic is reasonable, you might still be skeptical. So far, I provided a personal story of how optimism has helped me and some reflections on my experience. But if I'm going to prove that optimism is reasonable, then my primary instrument of proof should be reason. So, I want you to consider this. When you think of an intelligent person, do you think of an optimist or a pessimist? I personally think of a pessimist, someone who identifies problems, who casts doubt, who criticizes untested ideas. And this isn't just rooted in intuition or empty speculation. A national survey published by the Physicians Foundation in 2018 found that out of 8,774 American doctors, 62% were pessimistic about the future of medicine. 62%. Now with the global pandemic, it's hard to see these numbers going down. On the other hand, I want you to think of a successful person, someone who's made it. Mind you, this isn't limited to the elite oligarchy of entrepreneurs, CEOs, and political dignitaries. It could be someone you really look up to, like a classmate or colleague. Is this person more of an optimist or a pessimist? I dare to say optimist. So if intelligent people are pessimists and successful people are optimists, then it would imply that intelligence and success are fundamentally incompatible. The more intelligent you are, the less successful you are. The less intelligent you are, the more successful you are. But no, this is clearly wrong. We know it in our hearts to be wrong. But why? I found the answer in a book I read over the summer called Elon Musk, Tesla, SpaceX, and the Quest for a Fantastic Future. Needless to say, it was a biography of Elon Musk. As I read through, I kept asking myself, how could someone as intelligent as Elon be so optimistic? Isn't optimism inherently naive and, dare I say, foolish? What I ultimately learned from the biography was that Elon's optimism wasn't a coincidence. It was a crucial ingredient of his success. A few weeks later, I picked up a biography of Steve Jobs, and I realized that he too was a pronounced optimist. From that point on, my perspective on optimism completely changed, from believing it was something impractical to believing the exact opposite. It was no accident these great innovators of our time shared this trait. Optimism was a distinctive part of their personalities and their success. If there's one idea I want you to take away from this talk, it's that being optimistic is reasonable. Daring to do great things is reasonable. If everyone in the world said, you know what, starting a business is risky, so I'm not going to do it, then they would be right. And our world would also be a significantly worse place. Sure, you're far more likely to fail a business than succeed, but ultimately, we need businesses. And we can only have businesses when we choose to be optimistic, as the realistic approach is to never start one in the first place. By being realistic, we can by definition only maintain the reality we have. If we wish to improve reality, then we must be optimistic. And if we wish to destroy it, then pessimism is your friend. Imagine if every cancer researcher said, you know what? If the leading health institutions in the world can't find a cure for cancer, then why should I believe I can make any difference? Imagine if every entrepreneur said, well, I thought I had a great idea, but since other people aren't already doing it, it must be a bad idea. Imagine if every mathematician said, nobody's been able to solve this 100-year-old math problem, so clearly I can't either. Do you see how these are all perfectly sensible statements? And yet, if the cancer researcher decided to abandon her research, and the entrepreneur decided to scrap his idea, and the mathematician decided to ignore the 100-year-old problem, then society would be definitively worse off. We would be further away from a cure to cancer. We would have fewer groundbreaking companies. We would have more unsolved math problems. This is why it is not pessimism, nor realism, but optimism that is the key to human progress. What motivates institutions from all over the world to develop new and better vaccines? What ignites our businesses? What leads to advancements in the fields of mathematics and science? And since optimism is the key to human progress, it must be reasonable. Now you might be thinking, I'm not a cancer researcher. I'm not an entrepreneur. I'm not a mathematician, so these examples don't apply. Then let me ask you, are you the citizen of a democratic country with the ability to vote in elections? A common argument against voting is, hey, how much can a single vote mean? My vote doesn't matter, so I won't participate. This is yet another example of pessimistic thinking disguised as realistic thinking, which ultimately damages the society in which we live. It is only by taking the optimistic approach of affirming that your vote matters and my vote matters that we are able to preserve the heritage of democracy. What if you don't live in a democratic country? Well, I can guarantee you live on Earth, a place that has been ravaged by the effects of climate change. While climate change is signaled by governments and schools as a pressing issue, how many of us actually take steps every day to combat it? Like the voting example, a common pushback is that I'm one person. How much can my individual actions really affect the planet's health? And while that may seem like a sensible stance, it is ultimately a damaging one, inspired by realistic thinking. It is only by taking the optimistic approach of fighting against climate change in our daily lives that we are able to best safeguard our planet. Circling back to a question I proposed earlier, if being optimistic results in a better future than being realistic, is it really so optimistic after all? When John F. Kennedy gave his famous moon speech on September 12, 1962, he admitted that he didn't know what the benefits were of going to the moon. So why do it? He said, we choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Of course, the moon landing went on to become a cornerstone of American history and a giant leap for all of mankind. And it wouldn't have been possible without the optimism of the president and the optimism of his country. Now, this doesn't mean to do things simply because they are ambitious or daring. This is not a motivational speech, and optimism is not to be confused with toxic positivity. As Peter Thiel discusses in his book 0 to 1, we must be definite optimists. Optimistic enough to envision a brighter future, but willing enough to take the steps day by day to make it a reality. I firmly believe that if we see optimism as something reasonable rather than a matter of wishful thinking, then we will be more willing to practice optimism. And if we are more willing to practice optimism, then we will be more empowered to build a better future for ourselves, for our communities, and for all of society. Thank you.